She didn't choose her husband. She couldn't own property. She needed permission to speak in public. If she defied her role, the punishment could be public shaming or worse. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a bond, it was a contract of control. Behind closed doors and inside crumbling stone walls, the life of a wife was ruled by law, religion, and the iron grip of custom. These weren't just rules, they were cages. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a matter of affection. It was a legal and spiritual contract, engineered more for alliances, land consolidation, and social order than for love. The Church, holding vast influence over daily life, framed marriage as a sacred institution, one modeled explicitly on hierarchy. A woman was not her husband's equal, she was his subordinate. This was not simply cultural, it was doctrinal. Ephesians 5:22 was often cited from the pulpit. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. That line echoed through courtrooms, confessionals, and family discussions. To question a husband's authority was, by extension, to challenge divine order. Bishops, theologians, and civil lawmakers reinforced this view with precision. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential medieval thinkers, wrote that women were naturally subject to men, not only due to sin, but due to what he called natural order. In short, obedience wasn't merely expected, was sacred. Marriage arrangements began early. Among the nobility, daughters could be promised before they reached the age of 10. Among peasants, the church permitted girls to wed at 12, and boys at 14. These were not symbolic numbers. In many cases, the ceremonies were real and binding, especially once consummated. Child marriages served political aims, secured inheritance claims, and built fragile peace between rival factions. A daughter's body became a vessel of diplomacy. Consent was, in theory, required by canon law. In practice, especially for girls, that consent was shaped under pressure. Parents, particularly fathers, made decisions based on dowry negotiations. A daughter without a dowry had few marriage prospects. A daughter with a generous one became a tool for upward mobility. The dowry system locked women into transactional relationships. It also made leaving a marriage nearly impossible. If a woman fled, her family risked forfeiting the dowry. Financial ruin hung over every decision. The church insisted on monogamy and indissolubility, further tightening the grip. Marriage was permanent, save for extremely rare annulments. Even in cases of abuse, desertion, or fraud, the options for separation were limited. Wives who ran away could be charged with theft. If they took anything from the household, even clothing, in some regions, they could be flogged or branded. What emerges from the records is not simply a pattern of obedience, but an architecture of control. Marriage laws were not only enforced in ecclesiastical courts, they were supported by civil authorities, local councils, and neighbors eager to maintain order. A rebellious wife threatened more than a household. She was seen as a threat to the moral and social order itself. In this system, a woman's identity legally, spiritually, and economically was tied to her husband's. From the moment of marriage, she lost the right to make contracts, to appear in court without permission, or to own property independently. Her husband became her legal guardian, and in many cases, he was legally permitted to discipline her within the walls of a medieval home. The church's contract of obedience was not just a metaphor, it was enforced, expected, and institutionalized. In medieval Europe, silence was more than a virtue. For women, It was a commandment. Church leaders preached it from pulpits with clarity and consistency. A 14th-century sermon from John Merck declared that a woman must be meek and mild, speak but little, and in all things obey her husband. This was not an isolated view. Across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, clerics reinforced the notion that a woman's voice in public was not only undesirable, it was dangerous. Theologians and moralists alike turned to Scripture for justification. The letters of Paul were frequently cited. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, a directive echoed in every layer of society. In many towns, women were forbidden from testifying in court unless no male witness could be found. Their words were considered emotionally biased and legally unreliable. Civil codes reflected the same thinking in 13th century Toulouse city. Ordinances discouraged women from gathering in public without male supervision. In Germany's Saxon Mirror law code, a woman's voice held no authority in legal disputes unless related to childbirth or family matters. Her realm was domestic. Her voice was private. In households, the rules were even stricter. Manuals, like Le Ménagier de Paris, written in 1393, instructed women on how to behave like proper wives. A wife, it insisted, must not answer her husband harshly, even when wronged. Her virtue was measured not only by fidelity or modesty, but by how little she spoke. For elite women, the consequences of public speech could be social ruin. For peasant women, it could be corporal punishment. Husbands had the legal right in many regions to discipline a wife who was perceived as too loud, quarrelsome, or disobedient, and the community often participated. A woman known for arguing in public might find herself the subject of chivalry mock parades, where neighbors banged pots, shouted insults, or mimicked her perceived defiance. By the late medieval period, instruments like the scolds, bridle, iron muzzle with a tongue plate were introduced in parts of England and Scotland. Worn by women accused of gossiping or arguing too often, it was a public humiliation tool, designed to enforce silence through pain and spectacle. The underlying fear was power. Speech meant influence, and influence meant disruption. A woman who spoke her mind, especially in matters of religion, politics, or law, was often labeled a threat, sometimes even a heretic. Joan of Arc, burned in 1431, was accused not only of cross-dressing and claiming divine visions, but of overstepping her place as a woman by leading men and speaking with authority. Silence, then, was never neutral. It was enforced not only as a virtue, but as a boundary, a line between submission and rebellion, between order and disorder, between being seen and being heard. In medieval Europe, the home was not a sanctuary. From violence it was often where it began. Law, religion, and custom gave husbands authority to discipline their wives, and this authority included physical force. The idea that a man could beat his wife for her correction was not frigid, was legal, expected, and in many places, encouraged. Contrary to the modern myth, the so-called rule of thumb that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb doesn't appear in medieval legal texts. The phrase surfaced much later, in 18th century English commentary, but the concepts behind it was firmly entrenched centuries earlier. In both secular and ecclesiastical law, a husband's right to chastise his wife was rarely questioned, so long as it didn't result in death or maiming. In England, the 13th century legal treatise Fleta stated that a husband could beat his wife for correction if she disobeyed. The punishment was expected to be moderate, though the definition of moderate varied by region and circumstance. Church courts typically intervened only when the violence was extreme or public, as long as the abuse was contained within the home and didn't draw scandal. It was often ignored or tacitly accepted. Theologians reinforced this hierarchy. John of Salisbury, writing in the 12th century, compared a husband's authority over his wife to that of a ruler over his subjects. He described discipline as a moral duty. For many clerics and scholars, the family was a microcosm of divine order. God ruled over man, man ruled over woman, and discipline preserved this structure. In France, the Coutume de Paris foundational legal code explicitly permitted husbands to strike their wives to correct bad behavior, as long as they did not do so cruelly or outrageously. Again, enforcement was selective. Records from the Parliament of Paris in the 15th century show several cases of wives attempting to bring charges against violent husbands, only to be told the punishment was within legal bounds. One such case, documented in 1465, involved a Parisian woman who petitioned for separation after repeated beatings. The court acknowledged the bruises, but ruled that her husband's actions were within the rights of marital correction. Her appeal was denied. In parts of Germany, local ordinances made clear distinctions between acceptable and excessive violence. A husband might be fined for using a club or causing visible injury, but slaps, kicks, or belts were considered private matters. These rules didn't protect women, they simply limited scandal. Across Europe, public opinion followed the same logic. A wife who spoke out could be mocked, silenced, or punished further. Neighbors might even side with the husband, especially if the woman was seen as rebellious or disrespectful. Social norms did not just tolerate domestic violence, they often rationalized it. Legal scholars of the time debated the boundaries, but not the principle. Discipline was part of marriage. It was framed as moral guidance, spiritual correction, or domestic order. And for most women, there was no legal recourse, no safe exit, and no refuge, only the rule of the rod dot. In the medieval household, a wife's work began long before the sun rose and rarely ended before it fell. Her labor was constant, repetitive, and expected. Whether she lived in a peasant's cottage or a merchant's townhouse, her role was clearly defined: to maintain the home, bear and raise children, and support her husband's livelihood without pause or complaint. Bread making alone consumed hours. Grain had to be ground, dough kneaded by hand, and fires carefully maintained in crude ovens. In England, women were legally obliged to use the Lord's mill for grinding grain, often paying a fee. Failure to do so could result in fines or confiscation. From there, the day unfolded into a sequence of physical tasks: spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending livestock, hauling water, scouring floors, preserving food, making candles, and repairing clothing. Everything was done manually. There were no shortcuts. In urban century Paris or London, the expectations were no less demanding. Wives of tradesmen often doubled as business partners. They handled ledgers, managed apprentices, or sold goods while still cooking, cleaning, and raising children. In guild records, women occasionally appear as co-workers or widowed successors, but their names were usually buried under the identity of their husbands. Their contribution was assumed, not acknowledged. Childbearing added a constant layer of risk. A woman might become pregnant a dozen times in her life, often beginning in her early teens. Without access to modern medicine or reliable midwifery, Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. In some towns, mortality records show maternal death rates as high as 20% per birth. Even survival didn't guarantee recovery. Postpartum complications, infections, and malnutrition left many permanently weakened. Infant care was relentless. Wet nursing was common among the elite, but most women nursed their own children, often while continuing manual labor. Babies were swaddled tightly and carried on backs or hips while mothers worked. Diapers did not exist. Sanitation was minimal. If a child cried, the mother was expected to soothe it while baking, spinning, or sewing without stopping. There were no breaks, no holidays from duty. Even on religious feast days, women often spent hours preparing food for others while being reminded of their God-given domestic role. Church teachings reinforced this. Female saints were praised for humility, chastity, and devotion to home and husband. Sermons emphasized the Virgin Mary as a model not of leadership, but of quiet, enduring labor. Rest was rare, especially among peasants. Women often rose before men and slept after them. In times of famine or plague, they ate last. Their work was not optional. It was essential to the survival of the family. Yet, it was rarely recognized as labor. It was simply what a good wife did. To stray from these duties or to fall short was to risk moral judgment, marital conflict, or social exclusion. In legal codes and household manuals, a wife's failure to fulfill domestic responsibilities was sometimes grounds for public reprimand, or even physical discipline. The medieval wife was not just expected to manage the home, she was the home. Her labor sustained it, her body anchored it, and in return, society gave her neither respite nor reward. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a personal union, it was a legal transformation. The moment a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. This wasn't metaphorical. Under the doctrine known as coverture, which shaped English common law and echoed across much of Europe, a wife ceased to exist. As an independent legal person, she could not sign contracts, she could not sue or be sued, she could not buy or sell property, she could not draft a will. Everything she owned or might inherit came under the control of her husband the moment vows were exchanged. Even her clothing, unless specified in a premarital agreement, legally belonged to him. The concept of coverture appeared in legal commentaries by the 12th century, but it was fully solidified by the late Middle Ages. Influential legal minds, like Henry de Bracton and later Sir Edward Coke, described the wife as covered by her husband, her rights hidden beneath his authority. This wasn't an anomaly. It was considered normal and even virtuous. A woman who operated independently was seen as disruptive, even dangerous. In practice, this meant a widow had more legal rights than a wife. Once a husband died, she could reclaim some control, manage property, inherit land, and conduct basic business. But during marriage, unless specific exceptions were granted in local custom or through special legal instruments, her power was entirely mediated through her husband. Even wealthy women, those from noble or merchant families, found themselves restricted. A daughter might inherit a dowry or lands from her father, but upon marriage, her husband often took control of those assets. In Florence during the 14th century, merchant families sometimes used dota, contractual dowry system, to try and protect daughters' property. But loopholes and male relatives ensured that women rarely maintained full authority over those estates in England. Exceptions existed under equity courts, but they were difficult to access and usually limited to elite women with strong family backing. The vast majority of women, especially in rural areas, had no realistic means to contest their loss of property rights. Customary law varied across regions, but the principle remained intact. In the Holy Roman Empire, housefrau duties were limited to domestic roles. Legal records from Nuremberg and Strasbourg in the 15th century show women petitioning for access to their dowries or inheritance, often denied unless widowed or childless. In France, under Coutume de Paris, a woman could not alienate property without her husband's consent. In Catalonia, even businesswomen operating shops had to secure permission through male guardianship. This legal erasure wasn't just a matter of lit-shaped power, politics, and daily life. It ensured that women remained economically dependent. Without assets, they had no leverage. Without legal status, they had no voice. And yet, this system wasn't just sustained by kings or courts. It was upheld by priests, judges, neighbors, and families who saw in the subordination of women a stable social order, one where obedience was enforced not only through doctrine or violence, but through the simple denial of ownership. No property, no power, no place at the table. In medieval Europe, adultery wasn't judged equally. The law made that clear, and so did the punishments. A married woman suspected of infidelity faced consequences that were often brutal, public, and irreversible. A married man, on the other hand, could stray with little fear of legal or social reprisals, so long as his affairs didn't threaten property, bloodlines, or public scandal. Across Christian Europe, female chastity was linked directly to male honor and inheritance. A wife's fidelity ensured that her husband's heirs were truly his. Any breach of that certainty was treated as both a moral and a legal offense. In many cases, it was a capital one. In 13th century Castile, Spain, the Siete Partidas law code allowed a husband to kill both his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act, provided it occurred in his home. No trial, no delay. Similar laws existed in parts of Italy and the Germanic states. These were not laws meant to protect marriage, they were designed to protect male control over lineage. Public punishments reinforced that control. In some towns, women convicted of adultery were paraded through the streets with shaved heads or branded on the forehead. In Florence, during the 14th and 15th centuries, adulterous wives could be confined to convents, sometimes for life. In German towns like Augsburg and Nuremberg, civic records list women sentenced to public whipping or imprisonment for alleged affairs even when no concrete evidence existed. Execution was rare, but not unheard of. In England, records from the later Middle Ages include cases where a woman accused of adultery was burned at the stake or hanged, though this was often combined with accusations of witchcraft, especially during periods of social tension. The law did not always require proof. Suspicion alone could destroy a life. Meanwhile, men were largely shielded. Church doctrine technically condemned adultery in all forms. Thomas Aquinas wrote that it was a sin for both sexes, but church enforcement told a different story. A priest might publicly rebuke a nobleman for visiting prostitutes, but legal consequences were rare unless the affair threatened political alliances or inheritance rights. A husband's affair with an unmarried woman was often treated as fornication, not adultery. If the woman was of lower status, the relationship might not even be recorded. Even when a married man seduced another man's wife, the aggrieved party was not the woman's husband but the male relative, whose honor had been damaged. The hypocrisy ran deep. Women were expected to be guardians of morality, even as the law denied them equal agency. Church sermons often blamed female lust as the root cause of male sin, echoing the story of Eve. At the same time, male transgressions were dismissed as natural weakness. Legal double standards were reinforced by community enforcement. Gossip, surveillance, and public shaming ensured that women lived under constant scrutiny. A glance, a visit, or a rumor could lead to exile or worse. In contrast, a man's infidelity was frequently met with knowing silence. In theory, fidelity was sacred. In practice, it was a test applied to one half of the marriage, with the full weight of the law aimed only at wives. For a medieval wife trapped in an unbearable marriage, escape was not a right, it was a risk. The choices were few, and none came without cost. A woman who dared to leave her husband faced punishment that ranged from social exile to public execution. The message was clear: marriage was permanent. Breaking it could mean death. Annulment was technically possible, but only under narrow conditions. The Church granted them for reasons like consanguinity, impotence, or lack of consent and paper. In practice, annulments were rare and often accessible only to the wealthy or politically connected. Even then, the process was long, public, and humiliating. A woman had to prove that her marriage had never been valid to begin with, not that it was abusive or intolerable. Marital cruelty, neglect, or infidelity were not sufficient grounds. For most, the nunnery was the only sanctioned refuge. It offered protection, but only if one could pay for entry. A dowry was often required to join a convent, making the option inaccessible to many peasant or lower-class women. Noble women sometimes used the cloister as a way to avoid or exit marriages, arranged for political gain. But even this path was tightly controlled by male relatives, bishops, and family interests. When flight did occur, when a wife fled her husband's household without permission, the legal system treated it as a criminal act. In France and England, records from the 13th to 15th centuries include cases where runaway wives were captured, brought before local courts, and sentenced to public penance or corporal punishment. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, desertion by a wife could be grounds for imprisonment or branding. Worse still, women who left abusive or unhappy marriages risked being accused of witchcraft. By the late Middle Ages, this accusation became a convenient tool to punish women who defied domestic expectations. A wife who left her husband, rejected marital duties, or lived independently might be labeled a sorceress or heretic. The charge alone could ruin her. In Strasbourg in 1419, a woman named Katharina Lehmann was executed after being accused of bewitching her husband following a separation. There was no evidence, just suspicion and fear. Even the fear of being suspected kept many women in place. Church teachings reinforced this fear. Marriage was described as a sacrament inchangeable, ordained by God. To leave it was to sin. Priests preached obedience. Communities enforced it. Neighbors gossiped. Family members intervened. And the law, almost without exception, sided with the husband. There was no divorce in the modern sense. There was no legal category for abuse. There was only submission or risk. The medieval marital system was designed to contain women, not to protect them. It offered few exits and punished those who searched for one, whether through forced piety or the threat of death. It made sure that most wives stayed exactly where they were, bound to the household, watched by their community, and kept in check by fear. In medieval Europe, widowhood was not a straightforward path to freedom. For many women, the death of a husband marked not an end to subjugation, but a shift in its form. A widow might gain legal autonomy in theory, but in practice, her position remained uncertain, vulnerable, and often precarious. Canon law and regional civil codes technically granted widows a few more rights than married women. She could own property, manage an estate, or appear in court without a male intermediary. In some cities, especially in Italy and Flanders, widows ran businesses, took over family workshops, and appeared in notarial records as independent agents. Yet those cases were the exception, not the rule. The more common experience was far less empowering. In rural England, France, and the Germanic territories, widows were frequently pressured legally and socially into remarriage. This wasn't always driven by personal desire or affection, but by economics and control. A woman who held land through her late husband's estate often had limited authority over it. Her rights were typically usufruct, the right to use the land during her lifetime, but not to sell or pass it on. The lord of the manor, or, in noble cases, the crown, could withhold her dower lands unless she agreed to remarry, often to a man chosen for political or financial reasons. In many cases, the authority over a widow simply transferred to her son. If the heir was of age, she was expected to defer to him. If the heir was a minor, she might act as a guardian, briefly exercising power but under constant oversight from male relatives, ecclesiastical institutions, or feudal lords. Worse still was the suspicion. A sudden or unexplained death could cast a shadow of guilt on the surviving wife. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, legal records show widows dragged into court under accusations of poisoning or These cases increased in frequency during periods of social unrest, when scapegoating was common. In 15th century Strasbourg, a woman named Elsa Binder was publicly accused of killing her husband through sorcery. Her trial ended not in conviction, but in the confiscation of her property and banishment. Some widows did find real power, especially among the nobility. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled as regent for her son after the death of Henry II. Christine de Pizan, widowed in her 20s, used her status to write and publish some of the most influential feminist texts of the 15th century, but their visibility proves the rarity of their condition. For most, widowhood was a limbo state, neither fully free nor fully protected. Social expectations demanded mourning, chastity, and piety. Legal structures offered temporary authority but rarely full control. And behind every gesture of independence was the unspoken threat of social suspicion or legal reversal. The medieval widow, though technically no longer under the rule of a husband, rarely escaped the reach of patriarchy. Her value continued to be measured by her utility to her family, her feudal lord, or the church. Death did not dissolve the structure. It simply reshaped it. In medieval Europe, obedience wasn't enforced solely by the church or the law. It was upheld by the people who lived next door. The enforcement of gender roles operated as a decentralized system where neighbors, relatives, priests, even children played a role in monitoring, reporting, and punishing behavior deemed inappropriate for women, especially wives. Surveillance was informal but relentless. A woman's daily life unfolded under the watchful eyes of her community. If she raised her voice in public, contradicted her husband, or appeared too often without male company, she risked being labeled unruly or immoral. In many towns, particularly in England and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, even a perceived lack of modesty, laughing loudly, walking alone at dusk, or arguing in the marketplace could trigger public judgment. Clerics routinely reminded their congregations to monitor the moral behavior of their neighbors. Parish priests were expected to report scandalous wives to ecclesiastical courts, especially those who failed to fulfill expected household duties or who quarreled in public. In 14th century York, records from the church court reveal repeated summons for women accused of being scolds, a term used to mark those who spoke too freely or challenged male authority. Children were raised within this culture of correction. Girls were taught to obey silently. Boys were taught to expect it. In some towns, children were even used in public rituals to shame women. During Chevalier Noisy, mocking parade used to punish social offenders, local youths would bang pots, shout insults, and follow the accused through the streets. These events targeted wives seen as rebellious, loud, or sexually improper, reinforcing boundaries through spectacle and humiliation. One of the most visible tools of punishment was the scold's bridle, or branca metal head cage, fitted with a flat plate designed to press down on the tongue. Used in England and parts of Scotland from the 16th century onward. It was fastened onto women accused of being quarrelsome or insubordinate. Some bridles were attached to chains, allowing husbands or local officials to lead the wearer through town like livestock. Others were engraved with mocking phrases or bells to draw more attention. There was no trial, no defense, just punishment by display. Even in places where the bridle wasn't used, shaming rituals served the same function. A woman might be made to kneel in the church nave during Sunday Mass, dressed in rags, holding a candle of penance. In German-speaking regions, community-run courts, known as Femmergericht, kept records of women fined or flogged for disharmony in the home. The line between justice and gossip often blurred. Accusations were sometimes based on nothing more than rumor or personal dislike, but they didn't need to be true. The accusation alone could strip a woman of her reputation, isolating her from markets, from the church, from her neighbors. That isolation was a punishment in itself. What held this system together wasn't simply law or theology, was fear. Fear of shame, fear of exclusion, fear of being singled out in a society that rewarded silence and punished deviation. For the medieval wife, obedience wasn't just a personal duty, it was a public performance, monitored daily by an audience, ready to judge. For most medieval wives, the system offered no protection, no legal recourse, and no path to autonomy. But some refused to accept their assigned roles. Scattered in court records, ecclesiastical rulings, and local chronicles are traces of women who resisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. In 1328, in the English village of Martham, a woman named Alice Wade was fined for leaving her husband and fleeing to Norwich. She took clothing, coins, and a horse property considered his bylaw. Her act was classified as theft. Her motive never recorded. The case didn't result in execution, but Alice disappeared from official records after the trial. Whether she found safety or vanished into another town under a new name remains unknown. What's clear is that she broke the law to escape him. Other women took bolder steps. In late 14th century Ghent, a wife named Margaretha van Beverliet stood trial for poisoning her husband. The records state he had beaten her repeatedly and kept her locked in their home. She slipped arsenic into his wine. Margaretha was convicted and sentenced to death, but not before her confession spread through neighboring parishes. To authorities, it was a crime. To others, it became a cautionary tale, whispered warning that brutality could carry consequences. Disguise offered another path. In Italy and France, there are scattered reports of women dressing as men to escape arranged marriages or abusive husbands. In 1451, in Rouen, a woman named Jean Rollin was arrested for living under a male identity and working in a tannery. She had fled her home 2 years earlier and survived undetected until a former neighbor recognized her. Her punishment was public. Penance and exile not. Execution likely, because she confessed and claimed desperation, not deception. She cited fear of forced remarriage in her defense. Some women turned to the very institutions that oppressed them, using religious texts and church loopholes to assert independence. The 12th century Decretum Graciani, the foundational legal guide for canon law, technically required mutual consent for marriage. A few clever women used this requirement to annul unwanted unions by testifying they had never truly consented. These cases were rare and often contested by male guardians, but they appear in church court records from England, France, and the Low Countries. In Lubeck, in 1498, a woman named Gertrude Schult defended herself in court, using her husband's own infidelity against him. She provided witnesses, letters, and parish accounts, proving he had fathered a child with another woman. Instead of requesting punishment for him, she used the evidence to justify separating her property from his. A rare move that was granted under civic law. None of these stories became common knowledge. They weren't written into official chronicles or illuminated manuscripts. They didn't reshape the law, but they survived just barely in margins, trial documents, and church archives. They revealed that not all women were silent, submissive, or broken by their circumstances. Some found gaps in the walls that held them, some broke them. Their resistance was often punished. Their names were rarely honored, but their stories remain a fractured counter-narrative to the dominant silence. In the cracks of official history, these women speak, not with sermons or manifestos, but with actions that defied a system built to erase them.